What if I told you there was a time in England when a man could lead his wife into a public market, place a rope around her neck, and sell her like cattle, while the crowd cheered and the law stood idle? No divorce courts, no mercy, just humiliation disguised as tradition. This wasn't medieval barbarism. It was Victorian England, the very era often romanticized for its manners and morality. The wife auction, as it was called, became the grim solution for working-class men trapped in unwanted marriages. For the poor, divorce cost more than a lifetime's wages, so they turned to the street, to spectacle and shame. It was supposed to be symbolic, an informal contract witnessed by the town, but to the women, it was a living nightmare. Imagine standing in the mud, surrounded by jeering faces, while your husband haggled over your price like you were a worn-out piece of furniture. In Lancashire, Sheffield, and Yorkshire, it was not uncommon to see a husband lead his wife through the square wearing a halter of rope or leather, sometimes fastened around her waist, sometimes her neck. Newspapers of the time reported these events with chilling normalcy, calling them curious customs of the lower orders. And yet, behind those words hid 1,000 broken lives. In one such town, Lancashire, 1834, the people gathered at dawn beneath a heavy gray sky. Coal smoke drifted above the market square, the smell of ale and livestock mixing into something foul. The clatter of hooves, the calls of traders, and the murmurs of onlookers created a rhythm of cruelty. Somewhere in that crowd stood Margaret Hale, just 21, her hands trembling beneath a frayed shawl. Her husband, Thomas, a factory laborer with coal-stained hands and eyes dulled by drink, gripped a rope tied loosely around her wrist. To him, this was business. To her, it was betrayal beyond words. 3 shillings, Thomas barked, raising his voice above the noise. Laughter rippled through the crowd. She cooks, she cleans, she talks too much, but she's young enough yet. Someone shouted back, I'll give you 2.5, if she throws in the frying pan. The crowd howled. The sound was animalistic, half amusement, half cruelty. Margaret's eyes searched for escape, but there was none. The constable leaned lazily against a post, pretending not to see. The auctioneer, a man who sold pigs and corn, nodded approvingly. A woman in the front row whispered to her friend, Best she goes to another home, poor thing. Another replied, Better than being beaten, I suppose. When the final bid was called, 5 shillings and a bottle of gin, Thomas spat into his hand and shook on the deal. The buyer was a widower from a nearby village, said to have a limp and a temper. He led Margaret away by the rope while the crowd dispersed, already forgetting the name of the woman they'd watched be sold like an object. But what they didn't know, what no one could see, was the seed that had been planted inside her heart that morning. The humiliation would not fade. The memory would not rot. In time, it would fester and bloom into something darker, something that would make even the newspapers fall silent. For that day, beneath the jeers and laughter, Margaret whispered a vow that only she could hear. If they see me as less than human, I will show them what humanity looks like when it breaks. And thus began the legend of the Lancashire widow, a woman sold for 5 shillings, who vanished for 3 years and returned not as a wife, nor a servant, but as a curse that walked the cobblestones of every man who had laughed at her pain. After that morning in the Lancashire market, Margaret Hale's name vanished from every ledger and record. Her husband, Thomas, spent the money on gin by dusk and was seen staggering down the cobblestone road, laughing about his profit. But the laughter did not last. Within a week, the buyer, her new husband, as the law mockingly allowed, was found dead in his bed, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. The doctor claimed it was heart failure, though the body bore strange bruises around the neck, and a halter rope was found at the foot of the bed. The case was quickly buried, much like the man himself, and Margaret was never seen again. Rumors spread through Lancashire like coal dust, fine, suffocating, and impossible to wash away. Some said she had fled to London, where poor women could vanish into factories and smoke. Others whispered she'd joined the traveling fairs, performing under a false name. But older villagers told a different story. that the woman who had been sold for 5 shillings had made a pact that day, not with man, but with something darker that listened from beneath the ground. For months after her disappearance, strange reports trickled in from the mills. Workers claimed to hear crying in the dark, the sound of a woman's voice echoing through the iron corridors long after the shift whistle blew. A foreman swore he saw a figure in a torn shawl standing by the riverbank where the mill water turned red from the dye vats. And always, the whisper followed, "She's come back for the husbands." At first, people laughed off the tales. Wife selling was dying out anyway, they said. The last one in Manchester had ended in a brawl, and Parliament was cracking down on immoral customs. But then, one by one, the men who had been present at Margaret's auction began to die. The first was Thomas himself, found in the alley behind the King's Arms pub, throat cut so neatly that the constable mistook it for an accident until he saw the rope burns around his wrists. The coroner called it suicide. The priest called it divine punishment. The townspeople called it justice. The second was the auctioneer, a man who had joked that day about adding the frying pan to the bargain. He was discovered at his own stall, slumped over the scales, his eyes open, mouth filled with dirt from the market ground. The rope was there again, looped neatly beside him, tied into a halter. By the third death, no one dared speak her name. In the taverns, men began drinking in silence. The laughter that had once filled the market square turned to murmurs of guilt. Some swore they saw her shadow in the fog, a figure with bare feet leaving wet prints even when the ground was dry. Others claimed that the smell of smoke preceded every death, as if the earth itself remembered her vow. And yet, not all believed it was a ghost. A widow who lived near the edge of town told the priest that she had seen Margaret, alive, scarred, and colder than death. "She's not from the grave," the woman whispered. "She's from what men make when they think no one will ever fight back." The town of Lancashire never held another wife auction. No law was passed, no decree issued. It simply stopped. As if the people knew, without speaking, that some debts were paid not with coins, but with silence and blood. By the spring of 1836, whispers of Margaret Hale's vengeance had spread far beyond Lancashire's soot-stained borders. From the moors of Yorkshire to the alleys of Birmingham, her name carried like smoke. Thin, choking, impossible to contain. The Lancaster Gazette printed a story titled "The Ghost Wife of the North," dismissing it as rural hysteria, but not before thousands of readers devoured every word. The paper described her as a wraithly woman draped in mourning, appearing only on nights when fog covered the churchyard and factory bells rang out of tune. To some, she was vengeance given flesh. To others, she was the guilt of England itself, walking the roads her country had paved with women's tears. But the most chilling part wasn't the folklore, it was the evidence. Police records showed that in every town where a wife auction had recently taken place, there followed a death. A husband gone missing. A broker found drowned in his own trough. A market clerk hung from the rafters. Each scene bore the same macabre token: a halter, knotted and left in plain sight. London officials called it coincidence. Priests called it the wages of sin. Yet to those who had once stood laughing in those markets, the meaning was unmistakable. Rumor became religion. Women began to leave small offerings at crossroads: pieces of rope, wilted flowers, bits of cloth tied in knots. For Margaret, they'd whisper, for all the sold ones. Even those who doubted her existence began to fear the legend. The halter had become her symbol, a reminder that cruelty does not vanish when the crowd disperses, it festers. And in the heart of England, that festering began to rot the conscience of an age that called itself civilized. In July of that year, a London journalist named Arthur Pembroke took the night train north, determined to expose the truth. He arrived in Blackburn expecting superstition, but what he found unsettled even his rational mind. The old market square was quiet now, boarded and forgotten, yet the townspeople refused to go near after dark. When he asked why, they told him to listen. And when he did, in the silence between the clock chimes, he swore he heard it: the faint creak of rope tightening, and a woman's breath catching just beyond the edge of hearing. Pembroke interviewed widows, mill workers, and priests. Their stories aligned too neatly to be dismissed. One old man claimed to have seen a woman walking by the canal at dawn, her dress trailing water though the ground was dry. Another told of a stable where horses refused to rest, stamping and whinnying as if sensing something unseen. Pembroke's final note in his travel journal read, "I came to uncover a myth. I leave convinced I have seen England's conscience made flesh." The article he published would be his last. A week later, his body was discovered in his London lodgings, an overturned oil lamp having set the room ablaze. Neighbors reported hearing a woman's voice moments before the fire, soft, calm, whispering something they couldn't quite make out. On the scorched wall, investigators found a symbol burned into the plaster, a looped halter. After that, no one wrote about Margaret Hale again. But her story continued to circulate in whispers, told by candlelight in boarding houses and workhouses, a tale mothers told their daughters as warning and as weapon. "Never let them sell you," they'd say, because even silence remembers. By the winter of 1837, Blackburn had grown quieter than ever before. The mills still clattered, but laughter had left the town. Men no longer drank past sundown, and women walked in pairs, whispering of the things they dreamed. In nearly every household, there was someone who claimed to have seen her, a face in a fogged window, a shadow moving where no one should stand. But it wasn't just fear that haunted them. It was something deeper, something that grew with every night they refused to speak her name. It was guilt. The town's parson, Reverend Alcott, tried to restore order by preaching that the hauntings were punishment for sin, God's way of cleansing wicked hearts. But even he couldn't hide the trembling in his voice when he spoke of the rope left hanging from the church gate one Sunday morning. The congregation found it swinging softly in the wind, tied in the same careful knot seen at each death. Alcott demanded it be burned, yet no one dared to touch it. That night, the church bell rang 13 times, though no one was in the steeple. In the weeks that followed, the sound of bells spread from town to town. Each toll seemed to echo the names of the wives who had once been sold, their stories resurrecting in whispers. One for Mary Holt, one for Anne Pritchard, one for Margaret Hale. The dead were no longer silent. They had become the air itself. And somewhere between superstition and justice, Blackburn began to unravel. Those who once defended the auctions now spoke of them as nightmares they wished to forget. But forgetting was impossible. The rope marks, the ashes, the creaking sound in the rafters, they reminded the living that the sins of the past do not fade, they wait. By February, fear had turned into madness. A mill owner, Henry Briggs, confessed before a crowd that he had bought his wife at auction 20 years earlier. His hands shook as he begged forgiveness, swearing that he saw Margaret's reflection in every mirror of his home. "She stands behind me," he cried, "watching, always watching." That night, he hanged himself with the cord from his study drapes. The next morning, a note was found pinned to his desk. "The price has been paid." The town constable tried to dismiss the deaths as hysteria, but records show he stopped sleeping altogether. His final entry in the station logbook read, "She is not a ghost. She is the part of us that will not die." As spring crept in, those who remained began leaving offerings on their thresholds: ropes, coins, wilted flowers. But one night, an entire block of the old market caught fire. Flames swallowed the stalls, the auction stand, the very place where Margaret had been sold. No one claimed to see who started it, though some swore they saw a woman standing within the blaze, her face calm, eyes glinting like molten iron. When dawn came, the fire had burned itself out. The market was gone, reduced to ash. In its center, among the ruins, the constable found something that made his blood run cold. A halter laid carefully in the soot, unburned, its fibers untouched by flame. From that day on, no one in Blackburn ever spoke of the wife auctions again. But still, on certain nights, when the wind carries the faint echo of bells, some say you can hear her voice, a whisper cutting through the dark. The debt remains. By 1838, The legend of Margaret Hale had slipped its Lancashire roots and crept into the rest of England like a fever no doctor could diagnose. In York, a farmer's wife was found wandering through the night market muttering about ropes and fire. In Nottingham, an entire auction was halted when the crowd swore they saw a woman's figure standing among the horses, her face hidden, her hands clasped around a halter that dripped water. What began as rumor was now chronicled in newspapers, not as ghost stories, but as warnings. The Morning Chronicle ran the headline, "The Haunted Markets of the North." Even the Times, which had once mocked working-class superstitions, printed a piece questioning whether England's conscience was haunted by its own cruelty. Parliament, of course, dismissed the hysteria. Divorce reform was debated endlessly, but wife-selling, though unofficially condemned, still lingered in the darker corners of society. There were whispers that the government wanted to silence all talk of Margaret Hale, fearing that sympathy for her would ignite rebellion among factory women and miners' wives. And perhaps it already had. For across the north, women began gathering in secret, lighting candles in the names of those who had been sold. They called themselves the Rope Sisters. They were seamstresses, mill workers, servants, women with little to lose. Their vow was simple: never again. Reports soon followed of these women disrupting markets, overturning stalls, freeing livestock, and tearing down auction platforms. In Sheffield, one was arrested for setting fire to a tavern said to have hosted sales. When questioned, she claimed she'd heard a voice urging her to finish what was begun. The magistrate laughed, until his home burned 3 nights later. The fire spread, as did the fear. Men who had once sneered now crossed themselves when passing a rope or hearing the name Margaret. The line between vengeance and justice had blurred, and it was impossible to tell. By summer, entire towns had banned auctions outright, not from law but from terror. The last known sale took place in Shropshire, a remote village untouched by reform. It ended as all the others had, abruptly, violently, and in silence. Witnesses spoke of a heavy fog rolling in from nowhere, thick enough to swallow the lamps. Then came the sound, the unmistakable creak of a rope tightening, followed by a woman's laugh so faint it might have been the wind. When the fog lifted, the husband who'd arranged the sale was gone. His body was found 3 days later in the well behind his home, a halter knotted perfectly around his neck. The clergy tried to claim these were coincidences. The authorities called them accidents. But even the skeptics began to avoid saying her name aloud. In letters, she became the woman with the rope, or simply H. And yet, beneath the fear, something remarkable began to stir, a movement born not of superstition, but of awakening. Writers, scholars, and a few brave women started penning essays condemning the ancient practice. They spoke of the debt of the sold wives, demanding that England face its sins. Margaret Hale had become both ghost and symbol, a martyr for the forgotten, a curse for the guilty. Her legend had transformed from vengeance to voice. And though no one could prove she still walked the earth, her presence lingered in every whisper, every reform, every spark of resistance that followed. It was said that whenever a woman stood up to a man who tried to break her, a faint sound could be heard in the distance, a bell tolling 13 times, and the whisper of a rope swinging in the wind. By the early 1840s, the tale of Margaret Hale had transcended mere folklore. It had become an obsession. In London's gaslit taverns and smoky drawing rooms, intellectuals debated her existence as though she were a political figure rather than a phantom. Scholars of the supernatural argued she represented England's collective guilt made manifest. Priests declared her a demon sent to punish the unrepentant. But for the working poor, especially the women, Margaret was something else entirely. She was hope in the shape of vengeance, justice cloaked in ash and rope. Pamphlets began circulating under the title, The 13th Bell, The True History of Margaret Hale. They sold out overnight. Readers claimed that merely touching the paper left faint soot marks on their fingers, as if the ink itself had burned. Spiritualists claimed to summon her in seances, insisting that Margaret did not seek forgiveness, but remembrance. Newspapers mocked them, until seances turned violent. In a notorious case recorded in 1843, a séance in Bath ended when the medium's chair burst into flames without any visible cause. She survived but refused to speak afterward, writing only one phrase before vanishing: "The fire is not done." Meanwhile, the government grew nervous. Too many were invoking Margaret's name to criticize the crown, to condemn factory exploitation, to speak of women's rights in ways that frightened the elite. Secret police infiltrated gatherings, destroying copies of the pamphlet wherever they found them. Yet with every suppression, the legend grew stronger, darker. Some said that those who tried to erase her met cruel ends: accidents, disappearances, madness. After the law passed, one would expect peace. Instead, England found itself haunted by subtler terrors. Auction sites were abandoned, yet people swore they saw flickers of firelight in their ruins. In Manchester, an old market bell rang 13 times on a windless night. Those who went to silence it found the clapper wrapped in a frayed rope that no one could explain. The church tried to bless the site, but their holy water boiled before it touched the ground. The legend spread beyond England. Travelers carried the tale of the burning bride to France, to Ireland, even across the Atlantic. In America, abolitionists invoked her name as a symbol against human bondage, comparing the selling of wives to the selling of slaves. Margaret Hale, wrote one activist, is the conscience of every nation that profits from another's misery. By the 1850s, her story had transformed from terror into theology. Some small sects in rural towns even prayed to her, calling her Saint Margaret of the Rope. They believed she could protect abused wives or curse violent husbands. Others feared invoking her at all, warning that she demanded remembrance, not worship. And yet, even as she became myth, her legacy reshaped the language of justice. For the first time, newspapers began printing terms like the rights of wives and domestic cruelty. In the end, Margaret Hale was no longer just a woman or a ghost. She was a mirror, a reflection of every sin England tried to bury beneath its cobblestones. And like all buried things, she refused to stay hidden. Some said she appeared once more, decades later, to a dying priest who had sold indulgences to silence victims. He confessed on his deathbed, weeping, that he saw her in the candlelight, her hand on the rope, her eyes neither hateful nor forgiving, only patient, waiting. By the turn of the 20th century, England had changed, or so it liked to believe. The smokestacks were taller, the carriages replaced by rumbling motors, and progress was declared the new religion. But beneath the surface of this industrial optimism lay archives no one dared to open. Files marked Domestic Commerce, 1835 to 1850. Reports from towns like Bolton, Sheffield, and Preston where, according to rumor, wife auctions had not simply vanished. They had gone underground. In 1902, a young journalist named Arthur Wren stumbled upon one such file in the basement of the Manchester Guardian. He had been researching a story on poverty when he found an envelope sealed with red wax. Inside were faded transcripts, witness accounts, and one charred halter strap labeled "Property of Margaret Hale, sold 1841." At first, he thought it a forgery, until he read the testimonies. They spoke of secret gatherings long after the public bans, where desperate men and women met behind barn doors to trade their burdens. Women too poor to flee, men too ashamed to keep them. The deeper Arthur delved, the stranger things became. Names were crossed out in ink darker than the rest, as if meant to erase not people, but guilt. Several local historians warned him to stop. One woman, a librarian from Lancaster, whispered that the ones who try to write about it all hear the same thing in the night, a bell that rings 13 times. Arthur laughed it off, but nights later, while reviewing the documents, he heard something faint from the street below. Metal striking metal, deliberate, measured. He went to the window and saw nothing but fog. Still, the echo lingered. 13 tolls. He never finished his article. His final note, found in the margin of a manuscript, read, "The past is not done with us." By 1910, the wife auction files had become something of an urban myth among journalists. Most refused to touch it. But one woman, historian Evelyn Grange, decided to finish what Arthur Wren began. She believed the truth was not in the auctions themselves, but in what followed, the quiet disappearances of the women who had been sold. Evelyn traced court ledgers, church records, and asylum admissions. Again and again, she found the same initials written in shaky penmanship, M.H. Her obsession consumed her. In her diary, she described dreams of soot-filled air and a voice whispering, "Count the tolls." In one entry dated October 17, 1912, she wrote, "I found a pattern. Every 13th entry, the woman's name is missing, replaced with a dash, as though she was erased by something other than ink." Months later, Evelyn vanished. The last person to see her alive was an assistant at the London Museum, who swore Evelyn had come to donate a strange object, a cracked church bell, small enough to fit on a table, with the word "Remember" etched along its rim. When the assistant returned the next morning, the bell was gone. All that remained was the faint smell of smoke. Today, the archives where Evelyn worked are still sealed, marked for administrative review. No one knows what became of the files, or of Evelyn herself. But local historians note something chilling. The same museum clock, long broken, rings exactly 13 times every October 17th. Margaret Hale's name had been erased from the official records, but her presence lingered, not as a ghost, but as a wound, an unhealed scar across the conscience of England. And no law, no reform, no historian could bury it again. For the past has a heartbeat, and it beats loudest when silence falls. Nearly a century later, in 1998, Dr. Harold Pritchard, a social historian from Cambridge, stumbled upon a reference to Evelyn Grange in a footnote of an old academic journal. The name was barely legible, smudged by time, but it carried one word beside it: missing. What drew Harold in wasn't her disappearance, but a citation attached to it: the 13th Ledger, Bolton Archives. Curiosity turned to obsession. Within weeks, Harold was in Lancashire, combing through mildew-stained boxes in a county storage room that smelled of damp wood and age. It was there, buried beneath birth registries and tax receipts, that he found a small leather-bound book. The cover bore no title, only a scorched handprint, as if someone had once tried to set it alight. Inside were fragments of Evelyn's notes, torn and reassembled, along with something even stranger, a list of names, followed by a single phrase written in uneven strokes: "Sold to the earth." At first, Harold assumed it was metaphorical, a dramatic flourish of a historian prone to mysticism. But deeper entries chilled him. They detailed excavations beneath old market squares where unmarked graves were discovered, the skeletons bound by rusted iron loops around their wrists, remnants, perhaps, of halters. Among the listed sites, one name appeared over and over: St. Mary's Market, Ashworth. On a fog-laden morning, Harold traveled there. The town was half abandoned, its marketplace turned into a cracked parking lot. Locals spoke of the Whisper Pit, a patch of earth where, some claimed, voices could be heard beneath the ground at night. Laughing off the superstition, Harold began digging near an old drainage ditch. Hours later, his shovel struck wood. Beneath the soil lay a small crate sealed with wax and rope. Inside, he found a piece of parchment, folded tight, and a rusted bell with faint lettering still visible under grime. It read, "Remember." The confession began not as an apology, but as an indictment. "I was sold," it read, "but I did not stay sold. The man who bought me thought me broken. Yet in the dark, I found others like me, women whose names were traded as if they were grain. We waited. We watched. And when the toll came 13 times, we answered. The rest was nearly unreadable, the ink warped by moisture, words running into one another like bleeding memories. But fragments were clear enough to make Harold's pulse quicken. Beneath the stones, ring the bell. One for each who never returned. The date at the bottom was 1849, 8 years after Margaret's auction. Harold took the items back to his hotel room. That night, he recorded his findings into a tape recorder, voice steady but weary. "It's not myth," he said. "It's burial. These women weren't forgotten. They were hidden, and perhaps they hid themselves. At 3:07 a.m., according to his final journal entry, Harold was awakened by a faint ringing. 13 tolls. The next morning, his room was found empty. On the bed lay the cracked bell and a new note, written in handwriting no one could identify. History keeps what justice cannot. Authorities declared it suicide. The bell, once catalogued by police, vanished days later. To this day, local residents claim that on certain cold nights, the faint echo of a market crowd can be heard beneath Ashworth's cracked pavement. Women's laughter, men's bargaining, and one clear voice whispering through the fog, "I was never yours to sell." Margaret Hale's legend, long buried beneath Victorian respectability, was not a tale of ghosts. It was a ledger of sins, and every name within it, no matter how faintly written, still waited to be read aloud. By the turn of the millennium, the legend of the Ashworth Wife Market had drifted into the quiet corners of English folklore, a half-remembered story told in pubs and ghost tours. But for one filmmaker, it was more than a curiosity, it was a calling. In 2004, documentary filmmaker Rachel Dunn, known for her historical exposés on forgotten British tragedies, came across Dr. Harold Pritchard's missing persons report while researching lost academics. The details fascinated her, a respected historian vanishing under mysterious circumstances while chasing the ghost of a 19th-century custom. The police had closed the case within months, calling it self-inflicted delusion. But something about the cracked bell, and that final note, stayed with Rachel. Driven by curiosity, she assembled a small crew and headed for Lancashire to make a short documentary titled The Last Market. Locals were hesitant to talk. When Rachel mentioned Ashworth, conversations ended, and faces turned cold. "That place should have been left to the dirt," one pub owner muttered. Eventually, an elderly woman, Edith Clark, agreed to speak, but only after sunset and only inside her locked cottage. Edith's tale was simple yet chilling. As a girl, she and her brother had dared each other to play near the old marketplace after dark. One night, they heard what they thought was a woman's singing, mournful, rhythmic, echoing from beneath the cobblestones. Then came the bell, 13 faint rings. Her brother ran home. Edith stayed long enough to see, in the mist, a figure standing by the lamppost, a woman in a torn bonnet, staring without eyes. "Not ghost," Edith said, her voice cracking. "Punishment." Rachel recorded every word. That same evening, she and her team began shooting drone footage of the old site. What they captured was disturbing, faint heat signatures below ground, movement patterns no wildlife could explain. A sound technician swore he heard whispers beneath the static. The following week, Rachel's crew began an overnight shoot near the former market arch, a crumbling iron gate half consumed by ivy. It was past 2 a.m. when the generator abruptly failed. Darkness swallowed the square. Her cameraman, Alan, kept recording, his night vision lens catching faint shapes moving beyond the mist. Not reflections, not shadows, but outlines of women walking shoulder to shoulder, their faces blurred as though refusing to be seen. Rachel's final recorded words were calm, almost reverent. "We're not alone here. This isn't just history. It's memory that refuses to die." Then the footage cut to black. When authorities arrived the next morning, the equipment was scattered, film reels unspooled, and Rachel's car left idling. No bodies were found. Only one tape remained intact, the one labeled 13th Bell Sequence. On playback, it showed Rachel standing in the center of the square, whispering softly into the camera. History keeps what justice cannot. Then, a single toll of a bell. The documentary was never released. Studio executives deemed it too psychologically disturbing. But fragments leaked online. Grainy frames of Rachel's pale face illuminated by candlelight, the outlines of unseen figures behind her, and that echoing bell. Internet forums debated it endlessly. Hoax, art piece, or something real. To this day, no one can explain the faint voices in the audio. Sound engineers claim the frequencies fall below the human range, like something not meant for ears, but for Earth itself. In 2023, Nearly 2 decades after the disappearance of filmmaker Rachel Dunn and her crew, a single piece of footage surfaced on a dark web forum under the title, "The 13th Bell, Director's Cut." It was uploaded from an untraceable IP address originating somewhere in northern England. At first, it seemed like another internet hoax, another attempt to exploit the mystery of the wife auctions of Ashworth. But for investigators who had worked the original case, one detail changed everything. The footage contained the unmistakable voice of Alan Price, Rachel's cameraman, who had been declared dead in absentia in 2009. The video opens with static and the faint hum of rain. Alan's breathing is shallow, ragged. "If you're hearing this," he whispers, "we went too far." His voice trembles, the lens flickering between darkness and the faint outline of an old stone arch. "She's still here." Not just her, them. All of them. The wives. They're not stories. They're buried here. Beneath us. The recording continues for 7 minutes before cutting to a jarring flash, the sound of metal scraping stone. Then silence. When the video resumes, Alan is inside what looks like an underground crypt. Faint carvings are visible behind him, each resembling a rope knot. His voice cracks as he says, "It wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. They were sold, and when no one remembered, they came back to remind us." For a brief moment, the camera tilts downward, capturing a line of skeletal remains half embedded in the earth. But what chilled viewers most wasn't the sight. It was the audio. In the background, dozens of faint voices whisper in unison, the same words over and over. "We were sold. We were sold." When investigators tried to verify the authenticity of the video, they discovered something eerie. The location shown matched the layout of the old Ashworth Market Square. After the leak, journalists and historians revisited the story that had long been dismissed as myth. Dr. Elaine Foster, a sociologist specializing in historical trauma, described the footage as a manifestation of inherited guilt, the collective echo of women who were stripped of identity and agency. But skeptics argued it was nothing more than an elaborate digital forgery. Yet strange occurrences followed the video's release. Several viewers reported hearing bells toll through their speakers, even when the sound file was muted. Others claimed the footage froze precisely at 3:13, the 13th frame of the 13th minute, revealing a blurred face, pale and still, staring directly at them. Authorities traced the origin of the upload to a derelict post office near Preston, Lancashire. When they searched the building, they found an old film canister labeled "The Last Market" and a weathered notebook belonging to Rachel Dunn. Inside were fragments of her final notes. The rope is the link between guilt and memory. The auction was not the end, it was the beginning. History doesn't bury the dead. It buries the truth. Today, the Ashworth site remains closed to the public. The government cites structural instability, but locals know better. They still claim to hear the faint toll of a bell on foggy nights, especially in late November, the anniversary of the last known auction. And when the bell sounds 13 times, dogs howl, street lamps flicker, and windows tremble in the wind. No one steps outside. For those who still remember, it's not superstition, it's survival. Because history doesn't forgive. It waits. By late 2024, the Ashworth wife market had become an online obsession. The resurfaced footage from the 13th bell spread through dark history forums, Reddit threads, and YouTube exposés, each one trying to decode the whispers, the faces, the hidden meaning behind Rachel Dunn's last words. Within weeks, the phrase "we were sold" became a haunting cultural echo, hashtagged, dissected, and sensationalized across the internet. But among the noise, one discovery reignited the story entirely. An independent historian named Thomas Leary, specializing in 19th century British social law, found an unlisted archive box buried deep within the Lancashire County Records Office. Inside were dozens of documents stamped parish property accounts, 1823 to 1841. But at the back, beneath layers of brittle paper, was something chilling. A sealed envelope marked only with the initials CW inside it. Leary found 3 items. A halter rope no wider than a finger, a scrap of parchment with the inscription, "The the 13th shall ring, and a faded daguerreotype of a woman with hollow eyes wearing what appeared to be a tattered bonnet. Leary's first thought was forgery, but the document accompanying the photograph listed the name Catherine Ward, sold to Mr. Abel Dyer, July 1829. Local historians had never seen the record before. When Leary tried to locate Catherine in the census archives, she didn't exist. No birth, no death, no record. It was as though her entire life had been erased. Days later, Leary began experiencing strange occurrences. Files went missing from his office drawers. Emails containing his research attachments were found corrupted. The night before he was scheduled to publish his findings, his wife awoke to find him sitting at the foot of the bed, whispering something over and over. "We were sold," he murmured. "We were sold." He had no memory of it the next morning. When Leary's report finally went live, it caused an academic uproar. The Royal Historical Society dismissed it as a hoax, yet linguists pointed out that the handwriting on the parchment matched verified Victorian ink samples from 1829, too precise to fake easily. More disturbing was the chemical test on the halter. Traces of human skin oils were still present. Soon after, Leary received an anonymous message through an encrypted email: "Stop digging. The 13th bell is not history. It's warning." Attached was a single image, an aerial photograph of the old Blackburn marketplace taken just a month prior. At the center of the square, faintly visible in the dirt, was the outline of a noose. Public interest reached a fever pitch. Podcasts, documentaries, and urban explorers descended upon Ashworth, desperate to uncover something. Anything tangible. Many came back with nothing but static-filled recordings and ruined equipment. Yet one journalist, Elena Moore, captured an anomaly during her live stream. As she panned across the square, the audio distorted, and a woman's faint voice whispered, "You can't sell what still breathes." The footage went viral overnight. The Ministry of Culture intervened within days, sealing the area under the guise of heritage site preservation. But locals knew it was something else: containment. They say officials heard the bell ring that night, not once, but 13 times. And when the sound faded, the wind carried what sounded like laughter, soft, distant, and bitter. As the legend spiraled back into the public eye, something began to shift beneath the surface of curiosity and disbelief. Historians like Thomas Leary and journalists like Elena Moore had stumbled upon something far older and far darker than the brutality of wife auctions, a secret buried so deeply that even the Victorian records had tried to swallow it whole. And at the center of it all was the 13th bell. In late 2024, Elena received a plain brown parcel with no return address. Inside was a small bell, tarnished and green with age, wrapped in a page from the Manchester Gazette, dated July 1829, the same date found in the record of Catherine Ward's sale. The bell was engraved with a single word: debt. Alongside it, a note written in scratchy ink read, "They were not sold for freedom. They were sold for silence." This one phrase sent Elena diving into court archives across northern England. There, she found sealed legal documents detailing something called the 13th Covenant, an unregistered contract between the Church of England and local mill owners. It authorized a practice where impoverished men could trade their wives to settle debts or avoid parish charges. These women were not merely sold for ownership, they were transferred to erase shame and evidence. Some of the buyers were not husbands at all. They were officials, doctors, and debt collectors. The auctions were, in effect, a system of human disappearance, hidden beneath the guise of custom. What horrified Elena most were the annotations scrawled in the margins of one 1831 document. For each transaction, the bell must toll 13 times to mark the severance between body and name. It wasn't superstition. It was ritual. As she pieced together more, Elena realized that every known auction site shared a grim similarity. The ground beneath each had once been a burial field for the poor, the unmarked, the forgotten. The bells, she theorized, were not merely ceremonial. When Elena shared her findings on a late-night interview, her tone was calm but trembling. It wasn't just misogyny, she said. It was erasure. Women made untraceable, deaths disguised as marriages, sins hidden beneath the weight of history. The bell didn't mark the end of an auction. It marked a burial. The host tried to laugh it off, but the lights flickered mid-sentence. The recording later revealed something uncanny, faint, rhythmic tapping underneath Elena's final words. When isolated, the sound formed a sequence, 13 taps. 2 days later, Elena vanished. Her last known location was a hotel outside Blackburn, where staff claimed she had checked out early, leaving behind only her laptop and that same bell. Its clapper was missing, but when investigators lifted it, they swore they heard a faint metallic hum, as if it were still ringing. Her unfinished manuscript was recovered from her cloud account weeks later. The title read, "The Bell That Bound the Living to the Dead." In it, she wrote one chilling conclusion. The wife auctions were never just commerce, they were containment. Every woman sold took with her a secret someone needed buried. Every bell was a lock. By the time her words were read publicly, the ministry had already seized all materials related to the 13th covenant. Yet something peculiar began happening in northern England. At every site once tied to the auctions, the ground began to shift. Locals spoke of vibrations underfoot at night, like faint drumming or the sound of earth exhaling. And then came the bells. Not from churches, not from towers, but from the soil itself. What if the bells weren't just echoes of the past, but voices carried through the bones of the earth? That was the question that began to haunt historians, priests, and even the few remaining locals of Lancashire. They called it the trembling ground. It began subtly. At dusk, near the old market squares where wife auctions once took place, the soil would vibrate just enough to make lanterns sway. People thought it was wind or trains passing miles away. But soon, the vibrations came with a sound, faint, distant tolls. 13 of them. Always 13. Farmers reported that livestock refused to cross certain patches of land. Children woke screaming about, women in the ground, whispering for help. When an excavation team from the University of Manchester attempted to investigate the remains of one such site, their instruments malfunctioned. The recordings they captured that night were filled with static, and, beneath it, something disturbingly human. A soft chorus of overlapping voices repeating a phrase in unison. "We are still sold." The researchers dismissed it as interference. But the technician who analyzed the files later refused to work again. He claimed he could hear his own name being whispered in the playback, spoken in a woman's voice he'd never heard before. Meanwhile, Elena Moore's disappearance had ignited online speculation. Some believed she faked her death to escape pressure. Others claimed the bell, the artifact she'd found, was cursed, an object used to bind the sold wives to their silence. And then a curious discovery spread across Reddit and fringe historical forums. Dozens of users from different towns claimed they'd found similar bells buried in their gardens, attics, or beneath old foundations. Each one was engraved with a single word: debt, silence, property, sin. It became an obsession for many. People started digging up their yards in search of the bells of the sold. But something darker followed: accidents, fires, vanishing. In December of that same year, a priest named Father Alcott, a retired clergyman who had once served in Preston, broke his silence. He claimed that as a young curate, he'd witnessed the final legal wife sale in 1901. The auction had been conducted not in a marketplace, but in the basement of a church. They said it was the Christian way, he whispered in an interview before his death. They said it was mercy, to trade her suffering for a man's redemption. But mercy does not bleed. Father Alcott confessed that he'd been instructed to ring a small bell 13 times as the exchange was completed. "They told me it freed her," he said. "But the moment I rang it, I heard another bell ring from beneath my feet." He described a hollow, echoing tone, as though coming from underground. "It was not the sound of metal," he said. "It was the sound of grief." After his confession aired, paranormal investigators and historians alike descended upon Lancashire. But the church where the event allegedly took place had been demolished decades earlier, replaced by a modern housing estate. Still, residents began reporting strange phenomena: cracks forming in walls shaped like rings, a metallic taste in the air, and most disturbingly, the sound of bells tolling from beneath the foundations during heavy rain. By the time winter turned to spring, the phenomena spread beyond Lancashire, across England, even into Europe. Bells tolling with no source, women's names appearing in frost or condensation on glass, and cold drafts that carried whispers of auction and debt. The ministry issued no statement. The church remained silent. But those who remembered Elena Moore's warning began to piece together a final, terrifying possibility. Perhaps the ground itself had become their grave and their voice. And every time the story was told, the bells were no longer ringing in memory. They were answering. Her name was Margaret Lane, though her friends called her Maggie. She was a museum archivist in modern-day York, quiet, reserved, and endlessly devoted to the forgotten corners of history. She didn't believe in curses or hauntings, not really. She believed in dust, in old ink, in the fragile breath of paper that carried the lives of the dead. But when she received an unmarked parcel in early spring, her faith in reason began to fracture. Inside was a small brass bell, tarnished, cracked along the rim, and tied with a frayed piece of horsehair. Beneath it lay a single scrap of parchment, brittle with age, bearing 3 words scrawled in brown ink: "We are bound." The handwriting was faint, but familiar. It matched the records she'd been cataloging the week before, marriage transfer documents from 1842, Lancashire County. One of the listed names made her blood run cold. Eliza Lane, sold for 5 shillings and a jug of ale to a man twice her age. Eliza's recorded birthplace? The same village where Maggie's grandmother had been born. At first, she laughed at the coincidence. But that night, she dreamed of a market lit by lanterns, where men in hats shouted bids and women stood motionless beside wooden posts. One turned to face her. She had Maggie's eyes. When she woke, her apartment smelled of smoke, though no fire burned, and the bell sat upright on her bedside table, its crack glinting faintly in the dark. Over the next days, her rational mind battled the impossible. Lights flickered in her office. Documents went missing, only to reappear in the wrong century's drawer. And whenever she handled an artifact from the 1800s, faint marks appeared on her palms, indentations shaped like a halter's rope. She stopped sleeping. Her colleagues whispered about exhaustion, paranoia, maybe even obsession. By the time Maggie visited the ruins of the old Lancashire Market Square, the wind had turned to a low, trembling moan, like breath against glass. She walked alone, clutching the brass bell wrapped in cloth. Around her, the earth looked bruised, uneven, as though something had been buried and dug up again countless times. At the center of the square, a single stone post remained, moss-covered, etched with rings where rope had once cut deep. She knelt, brushing away the dirt, and found carved words beneath. "Let no man buy what he cannot keep." The air shifted. The ground beneath her pulsed. It wasn't wind. It was rhythm, steady and hollow, like a heartbeat echoing beneath the soil. Then, faintly, she heard it. Bells tolling. 13. The same sound reported across centuries. Only this time, it wasn't distant. It was beneath her feet. When she lifted the brass bell from her bag, it began to vibrate, violently, as if trying to escape her grasp. Her fingers burned. The crack along its rim widened with a shriek of metal. She dropped it, stumbling back, but it didn't hit the ground. It hovered, suspended midair, ringing without movement, without touch. And then she saw them. Dozens of women, translucent and pale, emerging from the ground like rising mist. Their faces were solemn, their eyes hollow, their necks bound by invisible halters. They surrounded her in silence until one stepped forward, a woman with Maggie's features, but from another time. "We are not your ghosts," the figure said. "We are your memory." The bell shattered. The sound was deafening, not a chime, but a scream, like iron tearing through flesh. When Maggie awoke, the market square was gone. She was lying in her own apartment, covered in soil, the imprint of a rope burned into her neck. The bell was nowhere to be found. But beneath her window, on the cold stone ledge, someone had written with trembling fingers, "The auction never ended." When Maggie returned to her flat, Something had shifted in the air, not visibly, but deeply. The kind of change that hums beneath perception, where shadows seem heavier and silence feels too aware. Her reflection in the hallway mirror was the first thing she noticed. It looked back too slowly, its movements just a second behind hers. She turned away, heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of rope burn still faintly red across her collarbone. She touched it, it burned cold. For the next few days, she stayed home, claiming she was unwell. But the world outside didn't stop watching. The bell's sound seemed to follow her, soft, mournful chimes echoing from drains, door hinges, even from the ticking of her clock. She tried to ignore it, until one evening she received a letter slipped beneath her door. The envelope bore no name, no stamp, only a crude symbol drawn in ink, a loop and a cross. She recognized it instantly. The halter mark. Inside was a single line. The sale continues through the daughters. That night, she dug through her family archives again, desperate for reason. Every document, every census page, every photograph led her closer to a horrifying truth. The wife auctions of the 1800s hadn't just ended, they had evolved. Families like hers had once been publicly sold, and when the law changed, their servitude became hidden, repackaged through arranged marriages, debt contracts, and unspoken social chains. Her bloodline, it seemed, had never escaped. They were sold differently now, with paper instead of rope. She thought of her grandmother Ada, who'd disappeared in the 1930s. Rumors claimed she'd run off, but now Maggie wasn't so sure. She looked up the last known address, a cottage outside Preston, now swallowed by overgrowth. With trembling hands, she packed a small recorder, her camera, and that cursed family ledger. The halter symbol appeared again that night, scratched faintly into the frost on her window pane. The cottage stood in ruins, half devoured by ivy, its windows blinded by boards. The air carried the scent of wet wood and decay. As Maggie stepped inside, her recorder clicked on by itself, a faint hiss, followed by the sound of bells. She tried to speak, but her breath fogged before her lips could move. There were no modern furnishings, no remnants of electricity, only the lingering cold of a place that had waited too long to be found. She followed the noise to the cellar door, its wood swollen with age. The first step creaked under her weight. Below, in the flicker of her flashlight, she saw a row of old wooden posts, 3 still standing, 2 collapsed. Chains hung from one. Beneath the dirt, fragments of fabric and bone peeked through the soil. And then, carved into the wall, she found the same words she'd read in the square. Let no man buy what he cannot keep. Her breath hitched as she noticed something new beneath it. Fresh handwriting, carved not in the 19th century, but recently. We are the kept. Before she could react, the air in the cellar thickened. Whispering filled the room, layered and overlapping, women's voices speaking in tones of grief and rage. They sold us for bread. They sold us for debt. They sold us to survive. The recorder captured every word, though Maggie never pressed a button. The lights dimmed, and her reflection appeared in the dirt-caked mirror hanging on the far wall, but behind her reflection stood dozens of women. Some wore bonnets, others ragged dresses, their expressions hollow yet defiant. When Maggie turned, there was nothing there, only the lingering shape of shadows and the faintest echo of a bell. But she could still feel the halter's weight tightening around her throat. Maggie stumbled out of the cellar, gasping for air as though the voices had drained the oxygen from her lungs. The night outside was unnaturally still, not quiet, but suspended, as if sound itself refused to move. Her recorder, clutched in one shaking hand, buzzed with static. She pressed play, and for a few seconds, she heard nothing but the rustle of wind. Then, a voice, calm, measured, and disturbingly clear, whispered her name. Margaret Dawson. She froze. The name wasn't hers. It was her grandmother's. The voice continued, speaking not to her, but through her. You cannot break a chain that was made in silence. You can only speak until it listens. Then the recorder shut off. The batteries were dead, but the screen glowed faintly, displaying a single timestamp. 1856. The very year wife auctions had begun to die out. In the days that followed, Maggie's obsession deepened into something feverish. She listened to the recording over and over, convinced that hidden beneath the static were other voices, names, or perhaps confessions of the men who'd sold their wives for ale and coin. Her co-workers noticed the change. She stopped answering calls, stopped eating, stopped leaving her flat. Every wall was soon covered in old newspaper clippings and genealogical charts. And then, without meaning to, she found something she shouldn't have, a photograph from 1891, printed in a local gazette. It showed a small crowd in a marketplace, with a woman standing on a wooden crate and a rope tied around her neck like a collar. Her expression was unreadable, not fearful, not defiant. But behind her stood a man, holding the other end of the rope. The caption read, "The last sale at Ashbourne Market." Beneath the photo, handwritten in faded ink, was a name she knew too well, Ada Dawson. Her grandmother. The discovery hit her like a physical blow. Ada hadn't vanished. She'd been sold, publicly, brutally, and legally. But if that was true, then who had bought her? Maggie turned the photograph over and found more handwriting, purchased for 12 shillings by her husband's brother. The revelation made her skin crawl. Her family hadn't been cursed by chance. They were bound by blood, by the continuation of that same act repeated generation after generation. That night, she sat at her desk and began writing. Not an article, not a report, but a confession for all the women who'd been silenced by history. The voices from the cellar echoed as she typed, urging her on. Tell them what was done. But as she wrote, the room began to shift again. The walls darkened. The faint glow from her lamp flickered and warped, as if reacting to her words. On the window pane, letters began to form, this time in her own handwriting, though she hadn't moved from her chair. Do not finish this story. She froze. A cold wind brushed her neck, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure behind her reflection, a man in a bowler hat, face obscured, holding a rope. The halter. He stood motionless, as though waiting. Maggie didn't turn. She just kept typing, her hands trembling. They thought silence would erase us, she whispered. But silence is the loudest scream of all. And as the final word left her lips, the lights went out. The recorder clicked on one last time, its red light glowing in the dark. From its speaker came the toll of a distant bell, slow and deliberate, followed by a voice, Maggie's own, repeating the same chilling phrase over and over. The sale never ended. Weeks passed before anyone realized Maggie Dawson was missing. Her editor assumed she had gone on another obsessive research trip, until the landlord reported a smell seeping from under her door. When the police entered her flat, they found no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no forced entry. Only a desk covered in papers, an old rope coiled neatly beside her typewriter, and the faint hum of her recorder still spinning in the dark. On the wall above her workspace was written a single sentence in black ink. The price has been paid. Her laptop contained a finished manuscript, The Sinister Custom of Wife Auction, a forgotten history of violence and silence. It was comprehensive, factual, and disturbingly personal. Maggie had traced hundreds of records that historians had dismissed or ignored. Wives sold in markets as late as 1913, women traded for livestock, and even cases where families bought back their daughters after public sales. But within the margins of her research were chilling handwritten notes, ones no rational historian would include. The bell follows bloodlines. The buyers walk still. What disturbed investigators most wasn't the content, but the timestamps on her files. Every entry had been saved at 2:17 a.m., the same time, every night, for 7 nights in a row. That was also the hour neighbors claimed to hear a faint tolling sound through the walls, like a church bell underwater. When the manuscript leaked online, it spread like wildfire. Historians debated its authenticity, skeptics called it hoax journalism, and folklore forums declared it cursed. But one detail couldn't be denied. Maggie had uncovered legitimate public sale records from the 19th century that even local archives had lost. The truth, it seemed, had been hiding in plain sight, buried under polite words like domestic transfer and community resolution. 2 months after her disappearance, a letter arrived at the newspaper office. No return address, no sender, only a wax seal shaped like a halter. Inside was a small photograph printed in grayscale. A marketplace, an old wooden post, and a woman standing in the center, her face blurred by motion. Scrawled beneath it were 4 words in an uneven hand. She chose to stay. The authorities dismissed it as a cruel prank, but to those who'd worked with her, the message felt like a confirmation. Maggie had become part of the story she tried to expose. Some said she'd been consumed by her obsession. Others whispered that she'd joined the wives who refused to forget. In the years that followed, readers claimed strange occurrences while reading her work. One woman reported hearing faint bells whenever she opened the digital copy. Another swore the photograph on page 42 changed expression each time she looked away. The manuscript was eventually removed from archives due to public distress, though copies still circulate in hidden forums under the name The Widow's Auction. No body was ever found, but at the cottage near Preston, the same ruin where she'd uncovered the carvings, investigators found a patch of freshly turned earth, and beside it, her recorder. It played only static for 7 minutes before ending with a single, human breath. And if you listen closely, very closely, you can hear it shift into something else. A faint whisper that grows clearer with every repeat. The sale never ended. Years after Maggie's disappearance, her manuscript resurfaced, not in libraries or historical journals, but through whispers on the internet's forgotten corners. Academics denied its legitimacy, calling it folkloric fabrication, but survivors of generational abuse, historians of forgotten customs, and amateur researchers began connecting details that official records ignored. Market towns across Lancashire, Derbyshire, and Yorkshire still bore faint scars of wife sales, scratched initials on old posts, rusted hooks embedded in stone walls, even faint carvings of halters on bridge supports. And then, something stranger began happening. Small communities reported anonymous donations to local museums, objects wrapped in brown paper with no sender's name, a rope fragment, an auction ticket from 1835, a woman's wedding ring engraved with the word sold. Every package included the same handwritten tag, for remembrance. MD. Scholars speculated that MD was simply a collector's mark, yet some insisted it was Maggie's own initials, a sign she hadn't vanished, only shifted into legend. Those who received the packages claimed odd occurrences followed. Lights flickering whenever the parcel was opened, bells ringing in empty halls, and sometimes, late at night, faint laughter echoing through museum corridors, not mocking, but triumphant, as though the long-dead wives were reclaiming their stories, one artifact at a time. Meanwhile, journalists tried to revisit the topic, to reclaim Maggie's lost truth, but nearly every attempt ended the same way. Incomplete drafts, corrupted recordings, and sudden resignations. It was as though the story resisted being told again, protecting its own silence. Still, the more it hid, the louder the public's fascination grew. Because deep down, everyone sensed the same unease. Perhaps the wife auction hadn't truly ended. It had simply evolved. In modern forms, the trade looked different. Contracts signed under pressure, relationships bought through wealth and control, headlines that romanticized abuse as scandal. The old halters had become invisible, woven into laws, norms, and digital screens. Maggie's research, once dismissed, now read like prophecy. She had written, "When women are priced, whether in gold, status, or silence, the auction continues." Then, one winter morning in 2024, a podcast titled The Markets of Silence aired anonymously online. The voice hosting it was unmistakable, soft, measured, British, and hauntingly calm. It was Maggie Dawson's. She spoke of debt records, ancestral oaths, and the toll of unpaid freedom. The final words before the tape cut to static were chilling. Every town has its market. Every family has its sale. Authorities traced the upload to a forgotten parish in Derbyshire, Ashbourne, the same place where the last wife auction was held. When they arrived, they found no equipment, no signs of recording. Only an old wooden crate in the churchyard, engraved with her initials, MD. Inside was a halter, perfectly preserved, and a note written in a familiar hand. I told their story. Now they can rest. For weeks, people reported hearing bells tolling across the valley at midnight, though no church had rung them for decades. And somewhere in that wind, when the night was cold enough and the silence deep enough, locals swore they could hear a woman's voice whispering between the gusts, steady, unbroken, and unafraid. The sale is over. Ashbourne became a place people whispered about, the kind of town tour guides mentioned only in hushed tones. After Maggie's voice returned through that mysterious broadcast, a wave of curiosity swept across England. Journalists, filmmakers, and amateur ghost hunters descended upon the sleepy market town hoping to catch something. Proof, perhaps, that history had truly come alive. But what they found wasn't the dramatic spectacle they expected. It was worse. The air felt heavier in Ashbourne, thick with an invisible pressure that settled in the lungs. The marketplace itself, once a cheerful square, seemed unnaturally cold, even in daylight. Locals said the pigeons refused to land there, and no one could remember when the church bells last rang. In the center of the square stood the old auction post, preserved as a heritage relic. But in recent months, the post had begun to crack down the middle, as though splitting from within. Visitors claimed to hear faint weeping while standing near it. Others swore they saw shadowy shapes reflected in nearby shop windows. Women in tattered Victorian dresses, faces blurred, standing silently behind them. The town council dismissed it all as hysteria, a side effect of internet fame. Still, something in Ashbourne had shifted. One morning, a schoolteacher found a halter loop hanging from her classroom door. No one knew who had placed it there, but carved into the wood beneath were the same words that had haunted Maggie's manuscript. Let no man buy what he cannot keep. Within days, more loops appeared, around lampposts, trees, and even the bronze statue of a merchant that stood in the town square. Each seemed deliberately placed, yet no one saw who had done it. That's when the bells began again. They rang at 2:17 a.m., the hour connected to every entry Maggie had ever written. Locals recorded the sound, hoping to prove it was a prank, but the audio defied explanation. The tone was deep, distorted, echoing through the air as though it came from underground. Some nights it was accompanied by a chorus of murmurs, female voices reciting something low and rhythmic, neither song nor prayer. Paranoia spread through the village. The vicar stopped opening the church, claiming that shadows moved when no one walked. A historian researching wife sales in nearby towns vanished after her last phone call, in which she whispered that she'd found the ledger that Maggie never published. When police broke into her rented cottage, the only thing left was a notebook filled with sketches of halters and rope knots, and one chilling sentence written again and again. They're choosing their buyers. Soon after, Ashbourne was declared unsafe for tourism due to structural hazards in the old marketplace, though locals knew better. They said the earth beneath the square trembled when the bells rang, as if the graves below were stirring. But amidst the growing fear, some felt something else, relief. A sense that the women once silenced were finally being heard, even if their voices came through static, dreams, or wind. And as for Maggie Dawson, the woman who'd started it all, her legend became a ghost story, a warning, and a confession in one. Those who visit the square after midnight claim that if you whisper her name 3 times, you'll hear her answer, not from above, but from beneath your feet. I'm still here. The market never closed. What if I told you that history never ends? It only changes the way it haunts you. In the decades after the Ashbourne wife auction story resurfaced, England quietly erased the remaining records. Parish books disappeared, estate ledgers were sealed, and the last living witnesses simply stopped speaking. But silence, as we've learned, is never the same as peace. By the 1920s, those who inherited the old Dawson property spoke of unexplainable happenings, footsteps on wooden floors, the smell of smoke where no fire had burned, and a woman's whisper that followed them through the halls. Not sold, it would say. not yours. Workmen hired to renovate the cellar quit after finding bones beneath the flagstones, small bones, wrapped in lace, too deliberate to be forgotten. Officials dismissed the rumors as superstition, yet no one returned to finish the work. Then, in 1953, a photojournalist named Henry Collins visited Ashbourne for a feature on England's last superstitious town. He took 24 black and white photographs of the square, the church, and the old auction post. When developed, 23 appeared perfectly ordinary. The last one did not. In it, standing just behind the auction post, was a woman in a long dark dress, head bowed, hands clasped, but her shadow was cast in the opposite direction of the light. Collins dismissed it as a trick of exposure, until, years later, his grandson found the original negatives. The image wasn't a double exposure. The shadow was real, burned into the emulsion like a wound. When questioned, elderly townsfolk told him, "That's Maggie Dawson, love. She always comes back when men forget." Some claim the bells rang that night again, though no one could agree on what time. The negatives were locked away in a museum archive and later misplaced, but the curse, the memory, endured like a stain in history's fabric that refuses to fade. Today, the site where the auctions once took place is fenced off, its plaque polished by tourists who don't know the truth. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of the women who stood here and waited." But at night, when fog rolls down from the hills, locals swear the fences rattle as if tugged from the other side. Those brave enough to walk close claim to hear the faint cry of a market bell, followed by voices, dozens, overlapping, rising in a chant too ancient to trace. They say it isn't rage you hear, but recognition, the sound of women reclaiming what was taken, century by century, story by story. Some call it a haunting. Others call it history correcting itself. And if you listen carefully, beyond the whispers and the wind, you might still catch Maggie's voice, soft, defiant, echoing from somewhere between the earth and the ether. We were never sold. We were waiting to be heard. The sinister custom of wife auction stands as one of the darkest, most unsettling practices of Victorian England, a ritual that blurred the line between law, cruelty, and survival. It was not merely about ownership, it was about silence. And perhaps that is the true horror, that generations of women vanished beneath the weight of a system that mistook suffering for order. So next time you walk through an old English market, pause. Listen. Beneath the chatter of tourists and the rhythm of modern life, the echoes remain, soft, persistent, and human. The market may be gone, but the stories, the ghosts, the truth, they are still standing in the square, waiting for someone brave enough to remember them aloud. What if I told you history doesn't rest? It waits,